The stroller wheel was stuck. Not loose, not wobbling. Stuck, wedged sideways between the revolving glass door of the Children's Rehabilitation Hospital and the steel frame that held it, as if the building itself had decided that 3 babies were one too many to let through at once. It had already been a long morning before that door decided to make it longer. Ellen had refused her bottle twice before agreeing to a third attempt. Mira had insisted, with the full drama of a toddler discovering opinions for the first time, that she would only wear one shoe, and I had, after 4 minutes of negotiation I was too tired to win, let her. Sana had been fine, which somehow made the other two feel louder by comparison, the way calm children always do. We were only there for a routine follow-up, nothing urgent, the kind of appointment that exists mostly to reassure anxious parents that premature babies really do, eventually, catch up to the rest of the world. I had allotted exactly enough time to get there, sign in, and not be the mother sprinting down a hallway with a shrieking toddler under one arm. The door had other plans. I pushed, I pulled, I apologized to no one in particular, because that is what exhausted mothers do. They apologize to furniture, to weather, to their own hands for not being fast enough. Behind me, in the triple stroller, my daughters had opinions about the delay. Mira, the oldest by 4 minutes, screamed with the full authority of a girl who believed the world existed to inconvenience her personally. Sana, in the middle seat, watched the ceiling lights with the calm detachment of a philosopher. And Ellen, my quiet one, my late arrival, had simply started chewing on the strap of her own harness, unbothered, as if she had already decided nothing about this day was worth crying over. I had exactly one hand free. I had a diaper bag sliding off my shoulder, a phone wedged against my ear with nobody on the other end because the call had dropped 3 minutes ago, and a headache that had been building since 5 that morning. And then a hand appeared beside mine on the stroller frame. Long fingers. A watch I recognized before I recognized the wrist it sat on. A voice that used to make interns rearrange their schedules just to avoid being in the same elevator. "Let me," she said. I looked up. Victoria Cross had not changed. That was the first thought that landed, stupid and immediate, before the more important ones arrived. She still stood like a woman who had never once in her life doubted where she was supposed to be standing. Her coat was the kind of gray that cost more than my rent used to. Her hair was pulled back the exact same way it had been 13 months ago, the day I cleaned out my desk into a single cardboard box, because a box was all it took to hold 4 years of my life, once she decided I didn't matter. She freed the wheel in one motion. Of course she did. She had always been good at fixing things that weren't emotionally complicated. Then she straightened up, and her eyes moved past me, to the stroller. I watched her count. 1, 2, 3. I watched the number land somewhere behind her, composed, expensive face. Watched her do the math she didn't want to do. The math that started 13 months ago, in a conference room, with floor-to-ceiling windows, and ended right here, in a hospital lobby that smelled like antiseptic and old coffee. "They're mine," I said, before she could ask. "All 3. Something moved behind her eyes, fast and gone, almost before I could name it. Not surprise exactly. Recognition, maybe, the particular kind that arrives a full year too late to matter. "Lena," she said, my name landing strangely in her mouth, like she wasn't sure she still had permission to use it. "You knew there was one," I said, my voice steadier than I felt. "That wasn't enough to make you kind. I don't imagine 3 is going to do it either." She didn't argue. She didn't reach for an explanation. Didn't offer the kind of soft, practiced regret executives keep in their back pocket for moments exactly like this one. She just stood there, hands still resting on the stroller frame she'd freed a moment ago, absorbing the sentence the way you absorb a verdict you already suspected was coming. "I'm not going to pretend I have anything to say that would matter to you right now," she finally said. "You're right," I said. "You don't." I didn't wait for her reaction. I pushed my daughters through the now unstuck door and left Victoria Cross standing there, doing arithmetic she should have done over a year ago. I want to tell you that I felt triumphant. I didn't. I felt tired, and a little bit haunted, the way you feel when a door you thought you'd locked opens on its own. Because to understand that hallway, you have to go back. You have to go back to the version of me who still believed that if you worked hard enough, if you were valuable enough, the people signing your paycheck would eventually see you as a person and not a liability. I was a financial risk analyst. I found the fraud other people missed because I read footnotes nobody else bothered to read, because I cross-checked numbers at 11 at night when everyone else had gone home, because being good at something was the only kind of safety I had ever fully trusted. I had built 4 years at that company out of unpaid extra hours and quiet competence, the kind that doesn't announce itself, the kind that just shows up in the numbers being right when everyone else's weren't. I found out I was pregnant on a Tuesday. I cried in a bathroom stall, not from fear, but from relief, because it was planned, because my partner and I had spent 2 years, and more money than either of us wanted to talk about, to get to that Tuesday. The pregnancy turned complicated fast. My doctor used words like monoamniotic risk and close monitoring, and told me, gently but firmly, that stress was not a small factor here, that my body needed rest, my job wasn't built to give. So I asked for 2 mornings a week to work from home. 2. Out of 5, I brought a letter from my doctor. I brought data on my own output, because I already knew, somewhere in my bones, that I would need to prove I deserved what other people were given without asking. Victoria Cross read the letter in front of me. She didn't look up right away. When she finally did, her voice was even, the way people's voices get right before they say something cruel and call it honesty. Your pregnancy doesn't deserve special treatment, she said. It was planned. That makes it a personal choice, not a company responsibility. I remember the folder closing under her hand. I remember the specific sound it made, a soft final slap of paper against paper, like a door shutting somewhere far away. I didn't argue. I have thought about that a lot since, why I didn't argue, and I think the answer is that some cruelty is delivered so calmly, it doesn't feel like an opening for a fight. It feels like a verdict. I went back to my desk. I opened a blank email. I stared at the cursor for what felt like a long time, and was probably only 2 minutes. Around me, the office kept moving the way offices do, indifferent to the small collapses happening inside individual people. Someone laughed 2 desks over, a printer jammed and someone swore at it. Nobody looked up. Nobody knew that the woman quietly clicking through her inbox had just been told, in the calmest voice imaginable, that the child she had spent 2 years, and most of her savings trying to have, was an inconvenience her employer had no obligation to accommodate. I typed my resignation in 4 lines. I didn't cry until I was in the elevator, alone, watching the floor numbers count down, each one feeling like it was subtracting something from me, that I wasn't going to get back. I packed my desk into 1 box. 4 years fit into 1 box. There is something almost obscene about how little space a career takes up once you're asked to leave it behind. A framed photo of my partner and me at a lake we'd visited on our first anniversary, a mug with a chip on the handle that I'd meant to replace for 2 years and never did, a stack of notebooks filled with numbers only I could read, shorthand for discoveries no one else had bothered to make, a small cactus that had survived 4 years of my forgetting to water it, more resilient, it turned out, than the job itself. I carried the box past Victoria's glass-walled office on my way out. She was on a call, her back half turned, and she didn't look up. I remember thinking, with a kind of bitter clarity, that she probably wouldn't remember this conversation by the following week, that for her, it was one decision among 100 she made that day, filed and forgotten, while for me, it was the hinge on which an entire year of my life would swing. I was wrong about that, as it turned out, though it would be over a year before either of us knew it. The drive home was quiet. My partner met me at the door before I even had my key out, because I'd texted her 1 word from the parking garage. Done. And she knew exactly what it meant without needing an explanation. She held me in the doorway for a long time, neither of us saying much, because there wasn't much that needed saying yet. There would be plenty of time later for the practical terror of what came next. That first night was just for grief. I did not tell my parents for 2 weeks. I did not know how to explain that I had walked away from stability, from insurance, from the identity I had spent 4 years building, over a request for 2 mornings a week. Said out loud, it sounded small. It never felt small. It felt like the moment someone finally showed me, without any ambiguity left to hide behind, exactly how much I mattered to people who had let me believe, for years, that I mattered quite a lot. The months that followed were not cinematic. There was no single dramatic low point, just a long, grinding accumulation of small ones. I lost the salary. I lost the health insurance 3 weeks before I needed it most. I started freelancing. Cold emails at midnight, invoices that took 45 days to get paid if they got paid at all. At my 20-week scan, the technician went quiet in the way technicians go quiet, right before they say something that changes your life. 2 heartbeats had become 3. My partner gripped my hand so hard it left marks. I laughed, because it was the only response big enough for the fear and the joy sitting on top of each other in my chest. 3 was expensive in every language. 3 car seats. 3 of everything, on a freelancer's income, with a body that a doctor kept describing as doing more than it should have to. I went into labor at 31 weeks, 3 weeks after a routine scan turned into an emergency admission for preeclampsia I hadn't seen coming. Mira first, then Sana, then Ellen, each of them so small the nurse's hands looked enormous holding them. Each one rushed to an incubator before I'd even fully processed that they'd been born at all. I remember the room going quiet in a specific, controlled way medical staff have perfected. Urgent, but never panicked, at least not where I could see it. I didn't hold any of them for the first 6 hours. I lay in a recovery bed, listening to updates relayed by nurses who were kind in the practiced, careful way people are kind when they're not yet sure how a story will end. My partner moved between 3 incubators, like a woman trying to be in 3 places at once, which, in a sense, she was. I spent the next 6 weeks living in a chair beside 3 incubators, learning to read monitors the way I used to read balance sheets, learning that a dropping number on a screen could make my whole body go cold in a way no fraud investigation ever had. I learned the difference between an alarm that meant adjust the wire and an alarm that meant get a nurse now. Learned it the way you learn anything under duress, fast and permanently. Ellen's numbers were the ones that frightened me most, dipping twice in ways that sent a doctor jogging, rather than walking into the room. I sat beside her incubator on those nights, with my hand through the small opening in its side, one finger against her impossibly small palm, negotiating with a version of God I hadn't spoken to since childhood, offering anything, everything, in exchange for a steady number on a screen. She stabilized. They all did, eventually, each on their own timeline, each teaching me a slightly different flavor of fear, and then, slowly, a slightly different flavor of relief. I worked from that chair. One-handed typing, a laptop balanced on a rolling table meant for medical charts, client emails sent between feeding schedules, and pumping sessions timed by a clock on the wall that never seemed to move fast enough. My partner and I split shifts like a small, exhausted army, defending a fort made of plastic and wires. We survived on borrowed furniture, and a crib bought second-hand from a woman whose own children had outgrown it. We survived on the kind of quiet stubbornness that doesn't look like strength from the outside, because it isn't loud, it's just refusing to stop. There was a stretch, around week 4 in the hospital, when Ellen's numbers wouldn't stabilize, and I sat beside her incubator for 11 hours straight, refreshing a spreadsheet on my phone between checking her oxygen levels, because a client needed a report by morning, and rent didn't care whose lungs weren't cooperating. I remember thinking, somewhere around hour 9, that grief and spreadsheets occupy the exact same part of a person, the part that just keeps functioning, because stopping isn't actually an option. The bills arrived anyway, indifferent to incubators. A hospital invoice that made my hands shake when I opened it. A car repair we couldn't postpone. A landlord who was patient exactly once before he wasn't. Every hardship demanded its own small, ugly negotiation, and I got good at those negotiations, in a way I never wanted to be good at anything. I learned to pump milk with a laptop balanced on my knees, learned to draft a fraud memo in the 15-minute windows between feedings, learned that grief has a rhythm if you let it, that it comes in waves you can actually predict once you've ridden enough of them. My partner took the night shifts at the hospital, so I could sleep in 3-hour blocks that felt, at the time, like luxury. We stopped keeping track of whose turn it was to cry in the parking garage stairwell, because it stopped being anyone's turn specifically. It was just something that happened, on a rotating basis, without shame. The day all three girls came home was smaller than I'd imagined it would be. No fanfare, just 3 car seats clicked in with trembling hands, and a 15-minute drive that felt like it took a year. Our apartment, which had seemed impossibly small when we signed the lease as 2 people, suddenly felt like it was holding its breath around 5 of us. Slowly, the client list grew. Slowly, the invoices got paid faster, some clients even paying early once they realized how reliably my work outperformed what they'd been getting from larger firms. Slowly, the incubators became a nursery, and the nursery became routines, and the routines became a life that was smaller than the one I had planned, and somehow more mine than anything before it had ever been. I remember the first night all 3 girls slept through, the whole night, without a single alarm from a monitor or a cry down the hall. I lay awake anyway, unable to trust the silence, until my partner finally reached over in the dark and said, "They're okay. We're okay." And I let myself believe her, just for that one night, and it turned out to be true. I didn't think about Victoria Cross very often. I told myself I didn't think about her at all, which was a lie I got fairly good at telling. Some nights, rocking a screaming infant at 3 a.m, her voice would surface uninvited, calm and final, closing that folder all over again, and I would have to remind myself, out loud sometimes, that I had built an entire life since then, that owed her nothing. And then, 13 months later, a stroller wheel got stuck in a hospital door, and there she was. I spent the 2 days after that hallway encounter in a strange, low-grade state of dread, jumping at every unfamiliar email notification, half expecting a lawyer's letter, half expecting nothing at all, which somehow felt worse. My partner asked me twice if I was all right, and both times I said yes, and both times she didn't quite believe me, and both times she let it go anyway, because she'd learned, over the past year, when to push and when to simply stay close. She found me 2 days after that hallway, not in person. An email carefully worded, asking if we could speak. I almost deleted it. I read it 4 times instead, hunting for the flattery, or the excuse I was sure was hiding somewhere in the sentences. It wasn't there. It was short. It asked for 10 minutes, nothing more, and it didn't mention the babies once. I showed the email to my partner before I answered it. She read it twice, silently, and handed the phone back without telling me what to do, which was, in its own way, exactly what I needed from her in that moment. "Whatever you decide," she said. "I'll be there or I won't be, however you want it." I chose to go alone. I needed to know, without anyone else's presence softening it, whether I could stand across from Victoria Cross without either collapsing or exploding. I agreed to meet her in a public cafe, the kind with too many plants and not enough privacy, on purpose, because I wanted witnesses even if I didn't need protection. She was already there when I arrived, sitting with her hands folded on the table instead of on a phone. That detail surprised me more than it should have. "Thank you for coming," she said. "You have 10 minutes, I said. I timed it from the door. She didn't smile. She nodded, like that was a fair rule, and she started talking before the silence could turn into something either of us had to manage. "I said something to you that I have thought about more times than I can count," she said. "I told you your pregnancy didn't deserve special treatment. That wasn't a policy position. It was cruelty, and I dressed it up as one, because cruelty is easier to live with when it sounds like principle." I said nothing. I had promised myself I wouldn't make this easy for her. "I'm not going to tell you I didn't know better," she continued. "I did. I knew the accommodation you asked for was reasonable. I denied it because I resented how easily you asked for what you needed, when I never learned how to ask for anything. That's not an excuse. It's just the truth, and you deserve the truth more than you deserve an excuse." "You said impact matters more than intention," I said. It wasn't a question. It was a test. "It does," she said. "My intention doesn't undo what you went through. I'm not asking you to forgive me. I'm not asking you to respond at all, today or ever. I just needed you to hear it said plainly, without a job offer attached to soften it." I studied her face for the performance I was sure was underneath the words. I didn't find one. That unsettled me more than an obvious lie would have. "You have 6 minutes left," I said, and I watched something in her expression loosen, just slightly, like she'd expected to be thrown out, and instead had been given a countdown. "Can I ask you something?" she said. "And you don't have to answer." I didn't say yes, but I didn't say no either, so she continued. "Did you ever consider coming back, even for a moment?" I thought about lying, about giving her something clean and dismissive that would end the conversation faster. Instead, I told her the truth, because I'd promised myself I wouldn't perform for her, not even in small ways. Once, I said, the week after I resigned, before the money got tight, before I understood what I'd actually be trading, I thought about it for maybe a day. Then I remembered exactly what you said, and exactly how you said it, and the thought went away and never came back. She nodded slowly, absorbing that the way she'd absorbed everything else, without flinching, without trying to soften it into something more comfortable for herself. "I don't expect anything from you," she said, "not today, possibly not ever. I needed you to hear this from me directly, instead of secondhand, and I needed to say it without asking for anything back in the same breath. That's the whole reason I asked you here." She used the remaining time to say nothing more about herself. She asked, carefully, if the girls were healthy. I told her yes, in 3 words, and watched her nod again, filing the answer away without pushing for more. She didn't ask their names. She didn't ask to see a photo. She seemed to understand, correctly, that she hadn't earned either of those things yet, and might never earn them at all, and that understanding, more than the apology itself, was what finally convinced me she wasn't performing. I left first. She let me. She didn't call after me, didn't follow me to the door, didn't do any of the small manipulative things I had braced myself for on the walk over. I got 2 blocks away before I let myself cry. Not from anger this time, but from the strange, disorienting relief of finally hearing someone name the thing that happened to me, exactly as it happened, without a single word wasted on making it easier for them to say. It was 3 weeks later that she found the file. I heard about it secondhand, through a former colleague who still worked there, who called me sounding half amused and half disturbed. Victoria had ordered an internal audit of the fraud case I had originally flagged, the one whose credit had quietly, cleanly, been transferred to my old manager's name after I left. Every email, every timestamp, every draft report with my name in the metadata, still sitting in a server nobody had thought to clean, an entire trail of proof that had simply been waiting, patiently, for someone with the authority to look. My old manager, a man named Daniel Voss, who had spent 4 years taking credit for work he barely understood well enough to explain in a meeting, had apparently walked Victoria through his original findings with the same smooth confidence he'd always used on me, right up until she pulled the metadata herself and watched his story collapse under a single timestamp. My colleague told me Victoria hadn't raised her voice once during the confrontation. She had simply laid the documents on the table, one at a time, and let the dates speak for themselves. She fired him within the week, not quietly, not with a generous severance dressed up as mercy. She fired him publicly enough that the story moved through the industry the way stories like that do, fast and half-true, everyone adding their own details, until eventually, a version of the truth close enough to accurate settled into place. Several other analysts he had managed came forward afterward, quietly, with their own versions of the same story, work claimed, credit redirected, and Victoria opened a formal review into every one of them, this time without needing anyone's insistence to do it. I didn't feel triumphant hearing about it, the way I might have expected to. I felt, mostly, a strange, disorienting kind of grief. For the version of myself who had spent 4 years quietly accepting that this was simply how things worked, that competence without permission to be visible was just the tax women like me, paid to keep our jobs. Then she called me, not emailed, called. "I want to offer you a contract," she said. "Not a job, a contract, on the fraud case in the utilities division, full independent authority, your name on every report, unedited, market rate, and I'd argue you're worth more than market rate, but I suspect you'd rather I not argue that point today." "Why?" I said, and I meant all the versions of that question at once. "Why me? Why now? Why like this?" "Because you're the best person for it," she said. "And because I owe you work, you were never given the chance to finish." I didn't say yes right away. I told her I'd think about it, and I did, for 4 days, turning the offer over and over, looking for the trap I was sure had to be somewhere in it. I made a list, actually, on a legal pad at my kitchen table. Every way this could go wrong written out in plain handwriting. Every possibility that this was simply a more elaborate version of the same dismissal, dressed up in guilt instead of indifference. My partner watched me make the list without commenting on it for 2 days, until finally, on the third night, she sat down across from me and asked the only question that mattered. What does your gut say? Separate from the fear. I sat with that for a long time before answering. My gut, separate from the fear, said that the woman who had fired a manager publicly for stealing my work, who had called instead of emailing, who had used the word owe instead of offer, was not performing. My gut said the risk was real, but so was the opportunity, and that refusing out of fear alone would be its own kind of surrender. I called Victoria back on the 5th day and told her I had conditions. She didn't argue a single one. My name went on the contract exactly as I wrote it. My findings couldn't be edited without my signature, not even for tone, not even for length. If she tried to speak on my behalf, in any meeting, I had the contractual right to correct her in real time, on record, no discussion required. She had built most of these guardrails herself before I even asked for them, and the ones I added, she accepted without negotiation, as if she had been waiting for me to ask for more than she'd offered. One more thing, I told her, before I signed. If this doesn't work, if you go back to who you were in that conference room even once, I walk, and I won't give you a second chance to explain it away. That's fair, she said, without hesitation. I'd expect nothing less. Trust didn't arrive as a single moment. It arrived in installments, small and unglamorous, the kind of thing that only looks like anything when you add them all up months later. She paid my first invoice 2 days early, no note attached, no mention of it in our next meeting, as if punctual payment were simply the baseline and not something worth applauding. It was such a small thing. It was also the first time in over a year that money had arrived before I needed to chase it, and I sat with that fact longer than I expected to. She didn't comment on the babies in any meeting unless I brought them up first. Other executives in the room asked, sometimes carelessly, sometimes with a curiosity that felt like it was measuring my competence against my motherhood, weighing one against the other. Victoria never did. She kept the meetings entirely about the work, which was, in its own quiet way, a form of respect I hadn't realized I'd been missing. When I challenged a finding of hers in front of her own board, my voice steady but sharp, pointing out an oversight in her risk model that would have cost the company badly if it went unnoticed, she didn't flinch, and she didn't defend herself. She thanked me for the correction, on record, in front of 6 board members who I'm certain had never watched her concede a point so plainly before. Afterward, in the hallway, she asked me to walk her through my reasoning again, not to test me, but because she genuinely wanted to understand it better. When I needed a deadline extended because Ellen had an ear infection that kept us both awake for 3 nights straight, Victoria extended it without asking a single question about why, and then followed up 2 days later, not about the deadline, but simply to ask if Ellen was feeling better. I remember staring at that message for a long time, trying to find the angle in it, and eventually accepting that there wasn't one. There were smaller tests too, the kind I set without telling her I was setting them. I sent a report with a minor error buried in it, curious whether she would quietly fix it herself or bring it to me directly. She brought it to me directly, framed as a question rather than a correction, giving me the chance to catch it myself before she said a word. I sent an invoice slightly higher than our agreed rate, an honest mistake on my end, expecting a clipped correction. She paid it as submitted and asked me, gently, if the increase reflected a rate change I hadn't mentioned, giving me room to admit the error without embarrassment. None of it, on its own, would have meant much. Together, week after week, it built into something I hadn't let myself feel in her presence before, something close to safety. None of it felt like romance. It felt like something quieter and, in its own way, harder to earn. Respect that kept showing up on time. The first time she came to my apartment, it wasn't planned. She'd brought over a signed document that needed my countersignature, something that could easily have been emailed, and we both knew it. Mira greeted her by throwing a stuffed rabbit directly at her very expensive coat. Sana studied her, with the same unreadable calm she studied everything with. Ellen, mid-crawl, latched onto Victoria's shoe and refused to let go, treating her ankle like a personal acquisition. Victoria stood in my small living room, drool drying on her sleeve, a sock somehow removed from her own foot by a 9-month-old, looking more thrown off balance than I had ever seen her in a boardroom. "They negotiate worse than my board," she said, and it was such an unexpected, dry thing to say that I laughed before I could stop myself. It was the first time I'd laughed in front of her in over a year. She came back the following week, and the week after that, always with a reason attached, a document, a question about the case, an excuse thin enough that we both silently agreed not to examine it too closely. The second time, Mira decided Victoria's very expensive shoes made an excellent surface for finger paint, and Victoria simply removed them, set them by the door, and continued the conversation about the case in her socks, one of which, I noticed later, didn't match. She never mentioned it. She never asked me to control the children on her behalf, never treated their chaos as something that needed managing around her comfort. She just adjusted, quietly, every time. The third time, she arrived during dinner and, without being asked, picked up Sana's spoon when Sana threw it for the 4th time in a row, not out of frustration but out of some instinct I hadn't expected her to have, treating the small rebellion with the same patient seriousness she might have given a difficult negotiation. "Again," Sana said, delighted, and threw it a 5th time, and Victoria, to my genuine surprise, laughed. She learned things without asking. She learned that Ellen wouldn't sleep unless the second-to-last song on a very specific playlist was playing, and once, when my phone died mid-bedtime, Victoria pulled up the same playlist on her own phone from memory, having apparently memorized the order without ever mentioning that she had. She learned that Sana wanted her food touching, unlike her sisters, who wanted the opposite, and began, without comment, arranging plates accordingly whenever she stayed for a meal. She learned to read my exhaustion in the way I refilled my coffee, in the way my sentences got shorter by evening, and started showing up on the nights she suspected would be hardest, never announcing that she'd noticed, just quietly making herself useful. She never once called me strong for surviving what I'd survived. Other people did, often, and I had learned to hate the word slightly, the way it turned struggle into an inspirational headline instead of just the unglamorous work of getting through a day. Victoria noticed the unpaid bill on my counter instead, and asked if I needed help, plainly, without performance, and accepted my answer of no without pushing. She didn't argue with my pride. She simply, quietly, made sure the utilities division contract paid on a faster cycle going forward, so that no was a little less costly for me to say the next time. One evening, after all 3 girls had finally gone down, we sat on my worn couch, her expensive coat draped over a chair covered in crayon marks she hadn't complained about once, and she admitted, quietly, that she had never spent this much time in anyone's home before. Not really, not in the unguarded, unscheduled way she'd been spending it in mine. "Why not?" I asked. "Because most of my life has been managed," she said. "Meetings, calendars, appearances. This is the first place I've been in years where nothing is expected of me, except to hand someone a sock back. I didn't have an answer for that. I just let the silence sit there, comfortable, in a way silences between us had never quite been before. The threat arrived the way threats like that usually do, disguised as something ordinary. A senior executive at the company I was now auditing, a man named Callum Reyes, started making calls that weren't about the numbers. First to my old colleagues, asking questions about my personal history. Then, more directly, to me, a voice on the phone late one evening reminding me, in a tone dressed up as friendly concern, that a woman with 3 young children in an unstable custody situation should think carefully about how aggressively she pursued this investigation. My children weren't in an unstable custody situation. He knew that. The threat wasn't information, it was intimidation wearing information's clothes. I told Victoria the next morning. I watched her face go very still, the particular stillness of someone doing enormous work to keep their voice level. Her first instinct was protection, and her first instinct was wrong. She assigned 2 of her own security staff to monitor my building without telling me first. I found out from my neighbor, who mentioned a car that had been parked outside for 2 days. describing it with the mild suspicion of someone who watches too many crime documentaries. I confronted her that evening, in her own office, my voice sharper than it had been with her in months, sharper than I'd let it get in a long time. "You don't get to decide what protects me without asking," I said. "You did that once already, when you decided what my pregnancy deserved without asking me a single question about it. This is the same instinct wearing a nicer coat." She was quiet for a moment, and I watched her actually consider the accusation instead of immediately defending herself against it, which was, by then, exactly the kind of thing I'd started to expect from her and still found myself surprised by every time. "You're right," she finally said. "I told myself this was different, that protecting you wasn't the same as controlling you, and I convinced myself of that because it let me act faster, without the discomfort of asking, and possibly hearing no. That's not protection. That's just control with better intentions attached to it." "I'm sorry," she added. "I'll remove them today, and going forward, I'll ask first, every time, even when it's slower, even when it scares me not to act immediately." I studied her face for a long moment, looking for the crack, the place where the sincerity would slip and reveal something more familiar underneath. I didn't find one, and that unsettled me almost as much as finding one would have. She kept that promise. When the situation escalated further, she asked, every single time, even the time it clearly cost her something to wait for my answer, instead of simply acting, even the time I watched her visibly restrain the impulse to solve a problem for me, before I'd finished explaining it. I noticed the restraint. I don't think she knew I noticed it, but I did, and it mattered more to me than she probably realized. The intimidation didn't stop there. 2 days after the phone call, I noticed the same unfamiliar car parked outside my building for an entire afternoon, no license plate visible from my window. My partner walked the girls to daycare that week with her phone in her hand the entire way, ready to call someone, anyone, though we both knew that fear without proof rarely gets anyone to move quickly. I documented everything anyway, the way Victoria had taught me to document things in the fraud case itself, timestamps and screenshots and a log of every call, because if there is one thing 4 years of finding other people's lies had taught me, it was that a paper trail is the only kind of protection that survives being disbelieved. Reyes escalated anyway. He leaked details of my medical history from the pregnancy to a business journalist willing to run with a story that framed me as an unstable, disgruntled former employee manufacturing fraud allegations out of resentment. The article was careful in the way bad faith journalism often is, technically accurate in its smallest details and devastatingly false in its overall shape. It mentioned the premature birth. It mentioned a brief postpartum anxiety diagnosis I had disclosed to exactly one doctor and no one else. It asked, in a headline dressed up as a question, whether grief and hormones might be clouding my professional judgment. Clients began pausing contracts, one by one, cautious emails citing reputational concerns that never quite named what those concerns were. My name, which I had spent a year rebuilding invoice by invoice, started to look, online, like a liability again, the exact word Victoria had once used about my pregnancy, now aimed at the rest of me. I sat with my laptop open to the article, for longer than was good for me, reading the comments underneath it, each one, a small, anonymous cut. My partner eventually closed the laptop without asking permission. The one time in our relationship she'd made a decision like that for me. And I let her, because some nights the only mercy available is someone else deciding you've read enough. I called Victoria, not asking her to fix it, just needing to say it out loud to someone who would understand exactly what it cost me. She was quiet for a long moment on the other end of the line. "I'm calling a press conference," she said. "Tomorrow morning, I want you there, if you're willing, but I need you to know I'm doing this regardless of your answer, because it's the right thing to do, and I've spent too much of my life avoiding the right thing when it was expensive." I didn't sleep much that night. I kept thinking about the folder closing under her hand, 13 months and a lifetime ago, and wondering whether tomorrow would be another version of that same hand, deciding something about my life without my permission. I arrived the next morning, unsure, until the very last moment, whether I would actually walk into the room. I stood outside for a full 5 minutes, watching journalists file in with the particular hungry energy of people who suspected they were about to witness something worth reporting. My partner had come with me this time, her hand steady in mine, and it was that steadiness, more than anything Victoria had said the night before, that finally got my feet moving through the door. It wasn't. The press conference was crowded, cameras and microphones arranged in the particular chaos of a story people wanted to watch unfold live. Victoria stood at the podium with a steadiness I recognized, the same steadiness that once delivered a cruel sentence in a conference room, except this time, she pointed it entirely at the truth. She confirmed the fraud findings, my findings, in detail, with the original documentation displayed behind her. She dismantled the smear campaign, point by point, showing the manipulated timeline, showing the leaked medical information for what it was, an act of intimidation, dressed up as journalism. Then she said something she didn't have to say. A year ago, I denied this woman a reasonable accommodation during a high-risk pregnancy, and I told her, in words I still remember exactly, that her pregnancy didn't deserve special treatment. I was wrong. I have spent the past several months trying to correct that failure through my actions rather than my apologies, because I've learned that apologies without changed behavior are just a more comfortable way of doing nothing. The credit for this investigation belongs entirely to her, not to my company, not to me, to her. I stood at the edge of the room, and I felt something shift in my chest that I hadn't expected, something that had less to do with vindication and more to do with simply being seen, fully, in front of people who could no longer pretend otherwise. She risked real things to say it. Her board was furious, calling an emergency session within hours, and I later learned that 2 members had pushed, seriously, for her removal, arguing that a public confession of past discriminatory conduct was a liability no company should absorb voluntarily. Her company's share price dipped before it recovered over the following weeks. There were embarrassing headlines about her own past conduct, printed by the same outlets that had briefly turned on me, some of them cruel in ways that felt, uncomfortably, like a mirror of what had been done to me. She absorbed all of it without flinching, and never once asked me to make it easier for her. She didn't call me for reassurance. She didn't frame her own discomfort as something I owed her sympathy for. When I asked her, a week later, how the board meetings had gone, she gave me an honest, unflattering answer, and then changed the subject to ask whether Sana's fever had broken, as if her own professional crisis were simply less important than a toddler's temperature, and in that moment, more than any other, I understood exactly how much had actually changed in her. Reyes did not disappear quietly. He filed a defamation threat that went nowhere once the documentation was made public, and eventually left the industry altogether, under a cloud he had built entirely for himself. My clients returned, several of them apologizing, unprompted, for the contracts they had paused. My name, online, slowly stopped meaning liability and started, again, to simply mean my name. In the days after the press conference, something between us had shifted into a quieter register, neither of us naming it directly, both of us circling it the way you circle something fragile you're afraid of breaking by moving too fast. She came by more often and stayed later, and the excuses she brought with her grew thinner and thinner until, by the end of that week, she stopped bringing them at all, simply texting to ask if it was all right to come over, and I simply said yes. The confession came a week later, on an ordinary evening, in my apartment, after the girls were asleep and the dishes were half done in the sink between us. I remember the specific quality of the silence that evening, comfortable rather than tense, the kind of silence 2 people only share once they've stopped needing to fill it constantly. I need to say something, she said, and I need you to know it isn't guilt talking, because guilt made me look back at you in that hospital hallway, but guilt isn't what made me stay. I waited. I had learned by then that she chose her words carefully when they mattered most. I know Ellen won't sleep past the second to last song. I know Sana wants her food separated and Mira wants it together. Out of pure contradiction, I think. Just to keep me on my toes. I know you read contracts 3 times when you're frightened, even when you already trust the terms. I know exactly which look on your face means you need someone to leave the room, and I've learned to leave before you have to ask. That's not guilt. Guilt doesn't pay attention to sock preferences at 9 months old. Attention did that. Attention is what made me stay. Attention made me stay. I repeated, quietly, testing the shape of the sentence. I love you, she said, plainly, no performance in it at all. Not because loving you fixes what I did to you. Nothing fixes that. I love you because I've spent months learning who you actually are. Past the version of you I only ever saw filing accommodation requests and closing folders under my own hand. And the woman I found underneath is the one I want to keep learning, for as long as you'll let me. I didn't answer right away. I asked her the only question that mattered to me in that moment. How do I know this isn't guilt wearing love's clothes? You don't. Not from words, she said. You'll know from what I do next, and the time after that, and every time after that one. Our first real date was, by any measure, a disaster. Sana ran a fever the morning we'd planned it, and Victoria cancelled her side of the evening without a second's hesitation, arriving instead at my door with a bag of frozen peas for a fever compress, and zero complaints about the plans that had dissolved. Our second attempt happened 2 weeks later, and she arrived by public transit because her driver had the night off, and she refused to ask him to change his plans for her. She showed up 10 minutes late, slightly wet from unexpected rain, her expensive coat abandoned for a plain jacket that looked borrowed. We didn't talk about work once. The entire evening, we talked about the versions of ourselves that existed before either of us had learned to armor up. Hers built from a childhood that taught her love was conditional on performance. Mine built from watching my own mother apologize for taking up space until it became a kind of second language. There were setbacks after that, the way there always are. One evening, an old wound surfaced without warning. A stray comment of hers, thoughtless rather than cruel, about scheduling around the girl's routine, that landed too close to the memory of that conference room and the folder closing under her hand. The word, accommodation, spoken in a tone that, for one instant, sounded exactly like the woman she used to be. I told her so, my voice tighter than I wanted it to be, my hands shaking slightly in a way that embarrassed me, even as I let it happen. She didn't say that's not what I meant. She didn't ask me to look at how much she'd changed, as if her growth were owed applause on demand, or remind me of the press conference, or the fired manager, or any of the ledger of goods she might have pointed to instead. She went quiet, and she listened until I finished, and then she said, simply, I'm sorry. I'll be more careful with that. And the next time a similar moment arose, weeks later, she caught herself mid-sentence, stopped, and rephrased entirely, watching my face carefully as she did it, waiting to see if it had landed differently. A third date happened at a small, unglamorous diner near my apartment. Her choice, which surprised me until she explained that it was the first place she'd eaten as a teenager that hadn't been chosen by someone managing her image. We talked for 2 hours about nothing important, favorite terrible childhood television, the exact wrong way her mother used to fold laundry, the year I'd tried and failed to learn the violin. It was the first time I saw her laugh with her whole face, instead of the careful, contained version she gave in boardrooms. A fourth date didn't happen at all, because Mira came down with a stomach bug the morning of, and Victoria showed up anyway, not for me, but with a bag of crackers and ginger ale, sitting on my bathroom floor at 11 at night holding back a small girl's hair, asking nothing in return, expecting no credit for it. I watched her from the doorway for a long moment before she noticed me, and something in my chest that had been braced for over a year, waiting for her to prove this was all temporary, finally, quietly, let go. There was a night, later, when I told her about the fear that still lived in me, the fear that healed things can still be undone by a single careless sentence, that trust, once broken, keeps a hairline fracture even after it mends. She didn't try to argue me out of the fear. She said, I know. I'd be more worried if you didn't feel that. Just tell me when it happens, and I'll keep showing up anyway. And she did, every time, until the fear got quieter. Not gone, but quieter, the way old scars stop aching once you stop expecting them to. The children came around to her slowly, on their own terms, the way children always insist on doing things. Ellen, unsurprisingly, warmed to her first, the same quiet, unbothered creature she'd been since birth, simply accepting Victoria's presence the way she accepted most things, without fuss, climbing into her lap during a video call one afternoon, and falling asleep there while Victoria continued, without missing a beat, negotiating a contract clause in a hushed, careful voice so as not to wake her. Sana took longer, watching Victoria for months with the same detached, evaluating calm she brought to everything, until one afternoon she simply handed Victoria a crayon during a coloring session, without ceremony, a silent invitation that Victoria understood immediately and accepted with equal silence, the two of them coloring side by side for 20 minutes without a single word exchanged, which, for Sana, was as clear a declaration of trust as any sentence could have been. Mira, predictably, was the last to soften, testing Victoria with the particular relentlessness only a firstborn seems to possess, watching to see if this was a person who would still be there after being pushed. She refused Victoria's help with a puzzle for 3 weeks straight, insisting on doing it alone even when it clearly frustrated her, and Victoria never pushed back with force, never forced the closeness, just sat nearby, quietly present, offering help only when it was asked for and never before. The turn came on an ordinary Tuesday, no special occasion, when Mira fell attempting to climb onto a kitchen stool she'd been told twice not to climb, and it was Victoria, not me, who reached her first, scooping her up before the fall finished, holding her through the crying with a steadiness that had nothing performative in it. Mira quieted faster in Victoria's arms than I expected, and afterward, without any obvious transition, simply stayed there, and later that evening, walking down the hallway toward bedtime, she reached up without being asked and put her small hand in Victoria's, walking beside her like it was nothing at all, like it had always been that way. I watched from the kitchen doorway and had to turn away for a moment, my own eyes stinging in a way I hadn't expected. The adoption conversation happened carefully, months later, with lawyers and paperwork and, more importantly, with permission asked at every single step. Victoria didn't assume the role. She requested it, from me first, and then, in her own careful way, from each of the girls, kneeling down to their height to ask if it would be all right with them, waiting for an answer that mattered as much as any legal document. The proposal happened in the middle of domestic chaos. No candles, no orchestrated moment, just a kitchen with 3 toddlers underfoot, and a pot of pasta boiling over on the stove. Victoria knelt down anyway, ring in one hand, the other hand instinctively catching Ellen before she could grab the hot pot handle, and asked me to marry her, in the same breath she used to redirect a child away from danger. And somehow that was exactly right. Exactly us. Love folded into the mess of ordinary life instead of separated from it. The wedding was small. No press, no board members, no cameras. Just the people who had actually shown up during the year that mattered, standing in a backyard with mismatched chairs, and 3 flower girls who took their job far too seriously, scattering entire handfuls of petals in a single dramatic gesture, and then arguing loudly about who had thrown more. My mother cried through most of the ceremony, quietly relieved, she admitted afterward, that the story had ended somewhere she never could have predicted when I called her, over a year earlier, to tell her I'd quit my job over 2 mornings a week. Victoria's mother didn't come. A small, old grief neither of us pushed each other to explain fully, though Victoria squeezed my hand tightly during the one moment the officiant mentioned family, and I squeezed back, and we let that be enough. We wrote our own vows, short ones, because neither of us trusted ourselves not to fall apart with anything longer. Mine mentioned the folder closing, once, briefly, not out of cruelty but because it felt important to acknowledge the whole shape of where we'd started, to let the worst sentence she'd ever said to me sit in the same room as the best promises she was about to make. Hers mentioned attention, the same word she'd used the night she told me she loved me, expanded now into something closer to a philosophy than a single confession. I used to think love was a feeling you either had or didn't, she said, in front of everyone we cared about. I know now it's a practice. It's noticing. It's staying. On the ordinary days, not just the dramatic ones. I intend to keep practicing it, with you and with our daughters, for as long as you'll have me. There wasn't a dry eye among the mismatched chairs by the time she finished, least of all mine. 2 years after that stuck stroller wheel, we returned to the same hospital, this time for Sana's routine follow-up appointment. Nothing urgent, just the ordinary maintenance of a life that had, against every early odds, turned out healthy and full. The revolving door worked perfectly this time. No stuck wheel, no crisis, no stranger's hand appearing beside mine to fix what I couldn't manage alone. Victoria pushed the stroller through herself, 3 girls chattering at once about something involving a dog they'd seen in the parking lot, and I walked beside her, watching her navigate the door with the same steady competence she brought to everything, except now it was ordinary, now it was just Tuesday. She caught me looking and smiled, the small, private smile she only ever gave me. "What?" she said. "Nothing," I said, "just remembering the last time we were at this door." She glanced down at the stroller, at our daughters, at the life that had grown, slowly, and without permission, out of the worst thing she'd ever said to me. "I used to think that stroller was my punishment," she said quietly. Standing in that doorway, realizing what I'd dismissed, I know now, it wasn't punishment at all. It was the first glimpse of the only life I would have missed completely, if you hadn't been strong enough to walk through that door without me. I didn't have a clever answer for that. I didn't need one. I just reached over and took her hand, the same hand that had once closed a folder on my request without a second thought, now laced through mine at a hospital door that no longer meant what it used to mean. Inside, the appointment went the way most of Sana's appointments went by then. Unremarkable, a nurse cheerfully noting that all 3 girls were tracking exactly where they should be, that whatever fear had once lived in incubators and monitors had, mostly, become an old story we told, rather than a wound we still carried daily. Mira asked, loudly, if she could keep the tongue depressor. Ellen fell asleep against Victoria's shoulder halfway through, unbothered as ever by the ordinary drama around her. Sana watched the whole exchange with her usual calm, as if she alone had never doubted it would turn out fine. Afterward, we walked back out through the same revolving door, no wheel stuck this time, no stranger's hand needed, just 5 of us moving through it together, into an ordinary parking lot, on an ordinary afternoon. I thought, briefly, about the version of me who had stood in that same spot 2 years earlier, exhausted, sarcastic, bracing for judgment from a woman she had every reason to hate. That version of me could not have imagined this, not the wife beside her, not the daughters trailing behind arguing over who got to hold the tongue depressor, not the particular, hard-won quiet of a life that had finally stopped asking her to prove she deserved it. I thought about the folder closing under Victoria's hand, all those years ago, the sound of it, final and dismissive. I thought about how differently that same hand moved now, steady on a stroller handle, careful with a fevered child, open, always, for mine to find it. Guilt made her look back that day in the hospital hallway, but it was attention, patient and unglamorous, and given without any guarantee of being returned, that made her stay. And it was that same attention, offered and accepted in small, ordinary installments, that had built, out of the worst sentence either of us had ever heard her say, the entire unlikely shape of our lives. We walked our daughters through it together, into an ordinary afternoon, into the rest of a life neither of us had planned but both of us, finally, deserved.